Hello, boola boola. Finishing memory today. So we're going to be looking at the cognitive interview. In order to look at the cognitive interview, you do kind of need to know everything from the last bullet point quite well because they kind of lead into each other. So what is on the screen right now, I'm hoping you are up to date. This bullet point, we're going to be looking at how you improve eyewitness testimony, namely through the cognitive interview. There are other ways that you need to know, but or other ways that you can know, but you do need to know the cognitive interview. So let's get started. Cognitive interview. This is an interview, obviously, that is conducted by the police in order to elicit accurate recollections from witnesses, for example. So, as it says there, based on previous memory findings, that it is based on previous memory findings, and goes on the principle, and this is quite an important part actually. It is based on the principle that there are several routes into a memory, not just one. So it's not as simple as asking someone, "Oh, what happened?" There are different ways to elicit memory based on memory findings previously, and the four main elements. Now, you do need to know these four absolutely as a minimum. You do need to know a lot more about it, but I'm going to go through each of these four, and there is, as you can see, a voice note here for you to use as well. So these are four techniques that are used within the cognitive interview to try make recall of a witnessed event as accurate as possible. So let's start then. What do police do? You need to know what the standard police interview is. Some of you have been interviewed by the police as witnesses or maybe as potential criminals, I don't know. And the standard police interview, what's called the SPI, is a really, really bad way to question witnesses. They used a question and answer approach like you see on the left there: who, what, when, where, why, and how. These are not particularly good questions, and they're very, very different to the cognitive interview. So you do need to be able to compare the standard police interview to the cognitive interview. This is the main thing you need to know, in my opinion. I'm going to go through the four elements in a minute, but I do want to go through the differences between the standard police interview. So the standard police interview here has brief questions. They tend to be closed. Did you see the knife? Yes or no. Did you see the person in the hoodie? Yes or no. There's less detailed responses from the witness. So the police officer is usually in charge of how much is said. The question sequence is out of sync. So worth noting down here, in a standard police interview, the police officer does not follow where their witness leads them. So if, for example, your witness went on a tangent, the police officer would bring it back to the question that he or she wanted to ask next. They wouldn't follow the thread of what the witness was saying, and therefore you're not going to find out that much. Broken concentration, and there's no free talking. You're not really you're not really encouraged to elaborate that much. So the standard police interview is actually a very, very bad interview. It's just asking someone what they saw, which we know isn't particularly very good. We know can be highly malleable what they saw. The cognitive interview, and this is probably the most important part of the whole bullet point in my opinion, the cognitive interview is based upon many counseling skills. So it's almost like a counseling session. So the first one here, and I want you to note as many of these down as possible, because the cognitive interview is not just about the four elements I'm going to go through. Those are important, don't get me wrong, but the cognitive interview goes a lot deeper than these four elements, and this is where it goes deeper. So firstly, the interviewer will listen to the witness. Now, that seems quite obvious, but what we mean by listening is kind of what we have down here. It's active listening, when you give 100% of your attention to your witness. And we're not just talking looking them in the eye. We're talking about nodding at the right time. We're talking about using silence, for example, which is really powerful. It's making the client or the witness feel very, very special, very, very listened to. That is not easy. Most of you, and please don't take this the wrong way, have got absolutely atrocious listening skills. Counseling is an incredibly skillful event, and it is based upon listening. Listening is not just letting things go into your ear, it goes a lot deeper than that. So you need training for that. You absolutely need training to be able to listen properly. So you pause after each response. This is one of the most difficult skills to be able to do. Try do it with your friends later on, like in the next week or so. If you see your friends the next week, try listen to them, and when they stop speaking, I just want you to pause a couple of seconds. I don't say anything. Really consider what they had just said. You're going to find it unbelievably difficult, right? Or you're going to create a really awkward silence where they're looking at you like, well, did you hear me? Are you listening? Pausing after each response, giving the impression that you are listening, you are considering what they are saying, you're weighing up your response, is really, really powerful. And all the time, we want to just fill in the gaps of a conversation. So again, that's a skill. Cognitive interview also has open questions, and the whole point of it is about developing rapport. The whole point, by the way, about counselling, and this, which pretty much is the cognitive interview, is good counsellors can build a relationship with someone and a trusting relationship with their clients incredibly quickly. If you're planning to be a counsellor, do you think you're trustworthy? Do you think you ooze trustworthiness? Because if you don't, if you don't ooze it, then you're not going to be a particularly good counsellor. But a police officer in this case is trained how to build rapport very quickly with someone, how to build trust with someone very, very quickly. Cognitive interview is about minimizing distractions to be able to give the person the ability to be able to recall as much as possible. And you are encouraged to give as detailed responses as can possibly be. So there is no time limit to cognitive interview. Clearly, the cognitive interview is way more skilled than the standard police interview. A lot more techniques, a lot more skill, a lot more training needs to go into the cognitive interview. So that's one thing. I'm going to go through the four main elements of the cognitive interview, and I will cover this briefly in class as well. The first thing that's done is to see if you can change the narrative of what the order of what the witness saw. So let's just say that you're with a witness who saw a person get hit by a car, and then the car drove off. Like, you're witness to that. The police officer would say, okay, I would like you to tell me what you can remember, but in a backwards chronological order. So tell me what happened from when the car drove off going backwards. Remember, the whole idea about this is to try see if you can get to the memory from a different way. Maybe if you can't remember it chronologically, you can try remember it better from going backwards, for example, non-chronologically. So that you'll be asked to do that. You're also asked to give a different perspective. So you are asked to give a recollection of what the person on the other side of the road would have seen, or maybe the person who ran off in the car. So the police officer would say to you, I would like you to recall what happened as if you were the person in the car. What would you have seen? And that's going to try put you in a different place in your memory, and maybe you're going to be able to see something in that memory that you don't see from where you actually were. So change of perspective is quite important. The next one is the one that everybody forgets. Mental reinstatement of context. This is basically, if you remember forgetting when we looked at retrieval cues and about how internal, external environment, state and context are the same, what you are trying to do here is you're trying to get people back into the same internal or the same external state. So, for example, you may want to show them on Google Street View a map, a street view of where the incident took place. Or maybe you're going to want to actually go there with your witness. You're putting them in the same environment when they saw the crash happen. The other thing as well is trying to get them to think about how they felt. That's such an important question. A good question for a cognitive interview would be, tell me how you felt when you saw the car hit the person. That person's going to be like, I felt really scared. I felt really anxious. I felt adrenaline, for example, and that may trigger off some internal environment in them that they feel that again, and thus they can remember. So it's mental reinstatement of context is trying to get them in the same environmental and the same emotional aspects as to when they actually experience the event. So you might be asked what the weather was like, for example. So like a question about trying to remember things might be, tell me what the weather was like that day. And you're like, what's that got to do with anything? It was a really, like it is today, it's a really, really sunny, muggy day. And again, that might trigger off other memories. The last one, tell me everything you can remember about the event, no matter how insignificant. Do you remember before I said cognitive interview has a lot of detailed responses? This is where they mainly come from. So you're going to get a shit lot of detail. Most of it's probably not going to be actually that relevant. Fine. Some of it's going to be wrong. Remember, some of it's going to be wrong. But a good way to think about this, if you have three cognitive interviews with people who witnessed it, and all three say the same thing, it probably happened. It probably happened. So if they say, oh, the car was red, the car was red, the car was red, the car was red, that probably happened. But if you've got one person say, oh no, it was a new registration plate, but the other two people don't mention anything to do with that, there's more of a chance that wasn't the case. So reporting everything, you are going to be allowed through multiple cognitive interviews, you are going to be able to identify incorrect information, but you're going to be able to build a fantastic picture about everything that happened from the insignificant to the very significant. So reporting everything is quite important. Now that is pretty much the four elements, plus I should say this is particularly important that I would want you to be able to elaborate on as well. The mistake that students make is they just talk about these four. Talk about these counselling skills that are used, and you should do quite well in this. So as I said, the basic premise of the interview is that memories have several paths. And one thing that's worth noting here, this cognitive interview is not like penicillin. It was not accidentally created and, oh, look, it really works, it's really effective. This has specifically been created off the back of memory research. So it should be quite effective. The other thing I do just want to talk about very briefly as well, the police are not the most empathetic people sometimes when it comes to the standard police interview. What the cognitive interview is also really good at is showing empathy and unconditional positive regard. Empathy is an ability to put yourself in the shoes of the person. So again, not everybody is empathetic. You can't train empathy. You either have it or you don't. Well, that's not strictly true, but it's very difficult to train. What you need to be able to do is find people who are naturally empathetic, and that's going to limit your pool of available officers. Does it work? Geiselman et al. Investigated the effectiveness of the cognitive interview, and this is a good piece of research now, particularly for the stats down here as well. I'm not going to spend my time reading that out when you can do it yourself, so you may want to pause that and make a note of that. Geiselman is not named in the spec, so you only really need to know the results, but it is useful, I would say, just to make sure you've got a relatively good understanding of the method. There is also this one just here by Fisher et al. As well, further research support So you probably want to, compared to the standard procedure used, the cognitive interview produced a 46% increase in recall and 90% accuracy. That's pretty good, and it's a good comparison between the cognitive interview and the standard police interview. It's more effective than the standard interview, reducing errors and producing higher recall as well. So clearly it does work. And that's your first evaluation, by the way. That's your first evaluation. The others are here. So first one is that, unfortunately, and I think all of these ones on this slide are negatives, they are limitations, weaknesses. It is time consuming. It does take a hell of a long time to, I don't have stats to hand, but it is much more time consuming and therefore, by the way, uses more money. All right, police forces are not exactly flush with cash at time of filming, so is it worth it? It's also time consuming to train the officers in the use of it, as well as time consuming. It's time consuming to actually do the interview because of people keep banging on about things. It may not always be practical for lesser crimes. So, for example, if you see someone rob a shop, is it worthwhile doing a cognitive interview? Man hours or women hours, hashtag feminism, people hours, let's call them, staff hours are limited in the police. So is it really worth it? Murders, yeah, sure, right? Sexual assault, absolutely. Robbing a Snickers from a corner shop, probably not really worth it, to be honest with you. Not really worth it. So police officers did not always use the cognitive interview, as quite frankly they didn't have the time. And okay, I'm not going to go through this, but other parts are seemingly more useful than other parts, or other elements in the cognitive interview. But as mentioned, and I've not bracketed that annoy, that's really annoying. Obviously, there is research support in the previous slides as well. Now, fine. Brilliant. Top notch. That is the cognitive interview. And with it, that is also memory done as well. So that's, if you are first year, that is you are 1/6 of the way through your college experience, which is quite mad, actually, when you think about it. The questions you get from this bullet point do tend to be relatively straightforward. People don't tend to do too well on these relatively straightforward questions because they just focus on the 4 elements of the cognitive interview and not the wider parts. So relatively straightforward bullet point, I think. Now that you have finished memory, you definitely want to make sure you have completed this in your workbooks and your flashcards. But that is memory. Peace out.